September 3, 1939. In the Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler's interpreter, Paul Schmidt, finished translating the final, fateful words of the British ultimatum. For a long moment, there was a total, deafening silence. The Führer, who had been so certain, so arrogant, sat as if petrified, staring straight ahead. He then turned to a stunned foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and asked a single, chilling question. What now? Nearby, the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, turned to Schmidt and uttered a prophecy. If we lose this war, may heaven have mercy on us. Hitler had gambled that Britain and France would do nothing as he devoured Poland. He had gambled, and he had lost. The war in Poland had just become the Second World War. With the bulk of the German army, its tanks, its planes, and its best divisions now committed hundreds of miles to the east, Germany's western border, the frontier with its most powerful enemy France, was almost completely naked. In that moment, many German generals were gripped by a cold, professional terror, convinced that the mighty French army would simply walk into Western Germany and there was nothing the Wehrmacht could do to stop them. But the powerful Allied counteroffensive never came. Instead, for 8 long months, the two sides mostly sat back and waited in a strange and surreal period that would become known as the Phoney War. This is the story of one of the greatest and most controversial what-ifs of the war. Why didn't the Allies attack Germany in 1939? This question is one of the most debated in all of military history, and we're going to deconstruct it piece by piece. If you're fascinated by the grand strategic decisions and forgotten battles that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the War Archives and hit the like button to support our mission. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's open the archives. While German infantry, cavalry, and tanks cut deep into Polish territory, Britain and France had sent Hitler their final ultimatum: withdraw your troops or face war. Berlin ignored it. So on September 3rd, London and Paris declared war. The German-Polish War was now a global conflict. In principle, the Nazi leadership had every reason to worry. The British and French empires combined possessed more troops, more aircraft, more warships, more manpower reserves, more natural resources, and a vastly larger industrial base than Germany. At that moment, just 11 German divisions, mostly second-rate, guarded the entire western frontier, huddled behind an unfinished line of fortifications known as the Westfall, or the Siegfried Line. All of Germany's armor and most of its air force were engaged in Poland. The French army, on the other hand, had begun to mobilize a colossal force of 4.5 million men. It had more than 2,000 modern tanks and 10,000 artillery pieces immediately available. Even without the British expeditionary force, which would begin to arrive within days, the French forces arrayed on the Franco-German border dwarfed their new enemies. German General Siegfried Westphal later estimated that if the French had launched a full-scale offensive in September, the German forces in the West could have held out for at most 2 weeks. This was the terrifying reality that must have troubled the Germans when French troops did, in fact, cross the border on September 7, 1939, in the nearly forgotten Saar Offensive. As part of France's alliance with Poland, Paris had agreed to launch an attack in the West within 2 weeks of mobilization. Given the shocking speed of the German advance in Poland, the French commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, started the operation early, and units of the 3rd and 4th French armies moved into German territory. They took the heavily mined Warned Forest and captured several villages within the first few days, but the overall French penetration was timid, no more than 8 kilometers on a 25-kilometer front. There was relatively little fighting. As one French soldier reported, "We have not suffered many casualties. Most were caused by mines. A soldier picks the kepi of a Hun officer, a mine explodes. He picks an apple, a mine explodes. The most dangerous mines have a fuse that delays the explosion." The French forces stopped short of the main Westphal fortifications on direct orders from the High Command, and a month of occasional potshots and skirmishes followed. Gamelin viewed this limited offensive as having fulfilled France's pledge to Poland, and he, along with most of the Allied command, felt that Poland was a lost cause in any case. In October, when the French learned that the Germans were transferring their victorious divisions from Poland back to the west, they withdrew their forces to the safety of their own Maginot Line. The short-lived Saar Offensive, which cost the French about 1,500 casualties and the Germans about 500, was the only ground operation of what would become known as the Phoney War. The German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel later admitted that this Allied inaction took many in the German High Command completely by surprise. "We were astonished to find only minor skirmishes undertaken. We did not understand why France did not seize this unique opportunity, and this confirmed us in the idea that the Western powers did not desire war against us." So why did the British and French not invade Germany when its western border was nearly undefended? One reason the Allies didn't act is that their entire grand strategy was focused on a long war of attrition, not a fast-moving, decisive war of movement. The British and French knew that in the longer term, they held all the cards. They had the same advantages over Germany that they had possessed in the First World War: larger populations, vaster colonial resources, and, crucially, access to the industrial might of the United States. They felt they needed to take time to fully mobilize their forces and their industries to be ready for a conflict they expected to take at least 5, perhaps more years to win. France in particular wanted time to buy more modern aircraft from the United States to strengthen its relatively weak air force, and Britain would need time to build up a full-strength army to fight alongside them. By the end of September 1939, there were only 150,000 British troops in France, far too few to share the heavy load of a major offensive. The Allies also immediately implemented a naval blockade of Germany, a key part of their long war strategy, though they greatly underestimated the impact that Soviet raw materials, now flowing to Germany thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, would have on Germany's war effort. Allied planners expected that their militaries and economies would be ready to go on a carefully planned offensive by 1941 or 1942. In any case, they had already accepted that Poland would be occupied by Germany, and their plan was to restore it after their own eventual, inevitable victory. The British diplomat Alexander Cadogan put the case bluntly and prophetically in mid-September 1939. "We must lose the war for 4 years before we win a decisive battle." A key part of this long war strategy was their deeply ingrained belief in the superiority of the defense, another powerful and ultimately fatal lesson they had taken from the bloody stalemate of the First World War. The French military doctrine was built around the idea that if Germany attacked first, the French would be able to bleed the Wehrmacht white from the advantageous, almost impregnable position of their Maginot Line, a massive and technologically advanced system of fortifications along the border. A defensive strategy, Paris hoped, would save precious French lives. France had suffered far worse than Britain or Germany in the First World War, and its low birth rate meant it had far fewer men of military age than its German rival. This demographic anxiety gave all the more reason for the French to wait until the British had raised a large enough army to help carry more of the load. French leaders also desperately wanted to avoid France becoming the main battlefield, as it had been in the Great War. This made neutral Belgium a key and frustrating part of Allied strategy. The Allies wanted to meet an eventual German attack in Belgium, but the Belgians stubbornly refused to cooperate in any war plans. Clinging to their strict neutrality, this was a critical weakness, as the Franco-Belgian border was not covered by the Maginot Line. Belgium's adherence to neutrality meant that France was strategically vulnerable, and it made it seem even less sensible for them to risk a major offensive into Germany. The Allied command, and particularly General Gamelin, was deeply frustrated by the Belgian position. They are unthinking, short-sighted mediocrities. Belgium must bear a heavy responsibility, and she will pay for it by serving as the power's battlefield. French planners were instead drawn to other, less direct strategies that might take the war elsewhere. There was talk of a plan to bomb the Soviet oil facilities at Baku to deprive the German army of oil. Allied leaders also discussed plans to drop mines into the Rhine River to disrupt German shipping, or potential interventions in the Balkans or Norway. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill even suggested a risky naval incursion into the Baltic. But any bold move in the West required political capital, and that was in desperately short supply in a deeply divided France. French politics were bitterly fractured between the far right and the far left, and the government was plagued by bitter personal rivalries. There were even some who whispered that France should not take a risk at the front in case Britain abandoned her and made a separate peace with Germany. The military leadership was also lacking. The Allied command structures were overly complicated, and General Gamelin was not a decisive, inspiring commander. The young Charles de Gaulle famously compared him to a scientist, experimenting calmly in a laboratory far from the realities of the front. In a series of high-level meetings in mid-September, the Allies officially confirmed their choice for a long-term, attritional strategy based on the defensive.
The Maginot Line lay at the very heart of this French military doctrine. Built between 1929 and 1937, its system of deep, well-armed and well-positioned fortifications stretched for 145 kilometers along the Franco-German border. The larger forts, the ouvrages, had multiple batteries of heavy guns hidden in retractable turrets and were connected by underground electric railways. They were state-of-the-art fortresses. The line perfectly fit with the French Army's doctrine, which was based on its winning formula from the First World War, a reliance on the mass use of artillery in a long war of attrition, where the defender held every tactical and operational advantage. Given that the French and British empires, with access to American production and finance, were ultimately stronger than Germany, this patient approach made sense to Allied leaders who were terrified of the potential cost of an all-out offensive. As the French General Henri Pétain had put it, France's approach to war was to be lavish with steel, stingy with blood. The French had a more modern army than in 1918, with more and better tanks, but their doctrine was still based on that of the previous war. Their tanks, which were arguably no worse than their German counterparts, were meant to support the infantry and advance slowly under the protection of a creeping artillery barrage. The French Air Force was also built primarily to deny French airspace to the Germans, rather than carrying out an offensive air war. The Armée de l'Air had only about 100 bombers at the start of the war. It was a centralized, controlled, and limited approach to fighting a war of material that did not lend itself to the unique dilemma of September 1939, when a bold strike at Germany might have won the war. Such thinking it framed French military thought for years, as the War Minister, General Louis Morin, had revealed in 1935. Why, having built our fortifications of the Maginot Line, would we leave them to embark on who knows what adventure? Another key factor in this thinking was that Allied analysts mistakenly assessed that Germany, which had been rearming for longer, had already reached its economic peak for war mobilization. Their faith in the strength of their own Maginot Line also increased their perception of the danger of attacking Germany's Westfall, even though the Siegfried Line was, in reality, unfinished and far weaker than they imagined. Even the better equipped and more motorized British Expeditionary Force adopted a defensive stance. When the first British units began to arrive in France in September 1939, they immediately started building their own line of bunkers and pillboxes, known as the Gort Line. So Allied strategy, doctrine, and politics all lay behind the failure to invade Germany in the fall of 1939. After Poland was defeated by German and Soviet forces in October, the Phoney War in the West remained in a state of surreal limbo. Both sides tried to take advantage of the lull by preparing for the inevitable spring campaign. Fighting was limited to artillery duels or small skirmishes, which, while rare, were still terrifying for those under fire. While we were cutting trees in the forest, we were bombarded by the Germans. I do not know how I was saved. One of my pals, lying 1.50 meters from me, was cut in two and died without a sound. Another, even closer, had his ribs broken and his belly opened by shrapnel. At some points along the Rhine River, French and German troops simply observed the comings and goings of the other side. German propaganda units set up loudspeakers to broadcast messages, trying to stoke anti-British feelings among the French. On the British home front, the mood was bizarrely optimistic, with the popular morale-boosting song, "We're going to hang out the washing on the Siegfried Line." Contrary to pre-war expectations, neither side waged a mass strategic bombing campaign. Both the British and the French feared that the bombing of cities would result in mass death and destruction, and the French, in particular, lacked adequate air defenses and radar. Pre-war British estimates had predicted that the Luftwaffe could drop 3,500 tons of bombs on London on the very first day of the war, and that 600,000 Britons might be killed in the first 6 months, on the principle that the bomber will always get through. These apocalyptic predictions for a knockout blow never came true because neither side yet had enough heavy bombers or a feasible plan for strategic bombing. The Allies feared retaliation if they started one, so both sides limited their air activity mostly to the dropping of propaganda pamphlets, reconnaissance flights, and limited bombing raids against naval targets away from major cities, a far cry from the devastating bombing of Polish cities by the Luftwaffe. The French improved their army's organization and equipment during these quiet months, but the lack of action and a long cold winter took a serious toll on morale and discipline. The months of inactivity during an especially cold winter ate away at French readiness for action. Morale and discipline suffered. Alcohol abuse, disease, and poor housing all contributed. Suicides accounted for nearly 4% of French military deaths during this period. Many men also resented wealthier or privileged Frenchmen who were avoiding military service. While many French troops spent the winter in uncomfortable barracks, conditions in the Maginot Line itself were often quite good. Still, the men found that spending most of their days underground sapped their morale. One soldier wrote in December, "I can assure you that I had enough of this underground life. I have been here since 23 August, and it is more than enough because, as you know, there is no distraction and we are only allowed 1 hour to breathe outside." The Phoney War also affected the relationship between the home front and the troops. The French writer Jean-Paul Sartre described the feeling. "A ghost war, a Kafkaesque war. I cannot feel it, it is fleeing me. When I left Castor on 2 September, I was ready for more and for better than this quiet mediocrity. Now I am infected, rotten." Some British officers took a dim view of their allies and suspected that the French army might be unreliable. General Alan Brooke recorded his reaction to a French march past in November. Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, clothes and saddlery that did not fit, vehicles dirty, and complete lack of pride in themselves and their units. What shook me the most, however, was the look in the men's faces, disgruntled and insubordinate looks. Behind the lines, both the Germans and the Allies planned for the major operations to come in 1940. In November, the Allies confirmed the Dial-Breda plan, which would see the British and French forces rush into Belgium and the Netherlands if Germany attacked them. It was a plan that could not be prepared in advance since the Dutch and Belgians still refused to work with the Allies. Hitler, for his part, initially wanted to attack in the West as early as November, but numerous delays and opposition from his own generals put off his plan, Case Yellow, until the spring. The Phoney War was a neglected and surreal period of the Second World War, and one that might not have happened at all if the Allies had struck in September 1939. But their strategy for a long war, their defensive doctrine, their doubts about their own capabilities, and their reluctance to take immense risks meant that all was quiet on the Western Front. But that would all change in May of 1940.